Okay. For 2.3.3, you're going to be reading pages 46 through 51, and we're going to think about how does Nick perceive Gatsby once he meets him. So let's switch here, and it starts with I was still with Jordan Baker. Where does it end? 51. Okay. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at a table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I had taken 2 fingerbowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. So now Nick's drunk. A lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. Your face is familiar, he said politely. Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war? Why, yes, I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before. We talked for a moment about some wet, gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. So a hydroplane is a plane that can it's like a boat, but it goes really fast. It's like a speedboat, I think. Okay, Siri has confirmed it is a boat. Okay, so Gatsby, I mean, you don't know this is Gatsby yet, but it is going to invite Nick to go with him. So, want to go with me? Old Sport, just near the shore along the Sound. What time? Any time that suits you best. It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. Having a gay time now, she inquired. Much better. I turned again to my new acquaintance. This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there. I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance, and this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a moment he looked at me as if he failed to understand. I'm Gatsby, he said suddenly. What? I exclaimed. Oh, I beg your pardon. So Nick's been talking to Gatsby this entire conversation, but he thought he was just talking to a partygoer. He didn't know it was Gatsby. So Gatsby says, I thought you knew Old Sport. So Old Sport is going to be a term that Gatsby uses because he thinks that's how rich people talk. It is not. No one says it. Tom makes fun of him for saying it later. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. He smiled understandingly, much more understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with the quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. So this is Nick's perception of Gatsby the first time they meet. Remember he said in chapter 1 that Gatsby was like different than anyone he has met and probably different from anyone he will meet. So he kind of says that again here. A rare smile with the quality of eternal reassurance you may come across 4 or 5 times. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. Whoops. It understood you just as far as you wanted to be understood, believed you just as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that at your best you hoped to convey. Precisely at that point it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or 2 over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. So this shows that he is trying to speak fancier than like people actually speak. Because he thinks that's how like wealthy people speak to each other. But Nick says it just missed being absurd. Sometime before he introduced himself, I got the strong impression he was picking his words with care. So remember that we don't know like Gatsby's background or what his purpose is, but you would think that someone who is choosing their words with care is trying to hide something. They don't want to accidentally give too much information. Almost at the moment when Mr. Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. So he has some business in Chicago, and they've called him in the evening. So he just says, like, if you want anything, ask about it. And then he leaves and Nick turns to Jordan. I had expected that Mr. Gadsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. Who is he? Do you know? He's just a man named Gatsby. Where is he from, I mean, and what does he do? Now you're started on the subject, she answered with a wan smile. Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man, so Oxford, the university in England, is what she's talking about. A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark, it faded away. So that means he was like starting to get an idea of who Gatsby is, but then the next thing Jordan says makes that idea fade away, and he still doesn't know who he is or what his perception of him, like the true Gatsby, should be. So she says that she doesn't believe it. She doesn't believe he went to Oxford. Why not? Nick says. I don't know. I just don't think he went there. Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. So it's like another rumor about Gatsby. No one knows the truth. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the Lower East Side of New York. It was comprehensible, but young men didn't, at least in my provincial experience, I believe they didn't, drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. Anyway, he gives large parties, said Jordan, changing the subject. And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. So that's like an oxymoron, kind of. There was a boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolia of the garden. Ladies and gentlemen, at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we're going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tostov's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation. He smiled with jovial condescension, and added some sensation, whereupon everyone laughed. The piece is known, he concluded lustily, as Vladimir Tostov's Jazz History of the World. So Nick says that the composition, he didn't know it, because as his eyes, just as it began, his eyes fell on Gatsby, standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. So Gatsby is not part of the party. He's separated. He's by himself, standing on the stairs, but he's looking at the party with an approving look in his eye. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. So that's the sort of attention to detail someone who's like trying to be very particular about their appearance would have. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact he was not drinking helped set him off from his guest, for it seemed to me he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. So as people began to get more and more drunk and were partying harder, Gatsby got more and more reserved and formal. When the jazz history of the world was over, girls were putting their head on men's shoulders in a puppyish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backward playfully into men's arms, blah, 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 blah. But no one swooned backward on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed in Gatsby's head for one link. I beg your pardon, Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. Miss Baker, he inquired. I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to see you alone. With me? She exclaimed in surprise. Yes, madame. She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler to the house. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all of her dresses like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movements as if she had first learned to walk upon a golf course in crisp, clean mornings. So I'm going to skip this part, more about people, just partygoers being drunk and dancing. He sees people that were having a fight, a couple. Blah, 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 blah. People are fighting. They don't want to leave. The men want to leave, but the wives don't. They're still fighting. So as I walked for my hat, in the hall door of the library opened, and Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. So when he was with Jordan in the library, that seems like he was more relaxed, but as soon as he leaves and he sees these other people, he like tightens up with formality again. So Jordan's party is calling her impatiently from the porch. She lingers a moment to shake hands. I heard the most amazing thing, she whispered. How long were we in there? Why, about an hour. It was simply amazing, she repeated, but I swore I wouldn't tell, and here I am, tantalizing you with the details. She yawned gracefully in my face. Please come and see me. Phone book. Under the name Miss Sigourney Howard, my aunt. She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute, and she melted into her party at the door. So Gatsby comes out, and he's like, hey, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. Don't forget, we're going to go on the hydroplane in the morning. And then the butler comes out, and he's like, you have another caller from Philadelphia. And they say good night. Good night, old sport. Good night.